Good morning, Hymn Society. How is everyone? Sorry. Maybe we'll do it in Latin. My name is Stephanie Budwey, and I'm the director of the research for the Hymn Society and also a member of the executive committee. Welcome to this sectional. Here we are today with our Emerging Scholars Forum. So very happy for you all to be here for us. We would like to welcome those who are with us online and those who are gathered here in person. And we would like to thank David English for sponsoring this session. So each year we encourage our graduate students and those who have graduated within the past few years to submit proposals to present their original unpublished research on congregational song. This year we have three excellent scholars: Fernando Berwig Silva, a doctoral student in the graduate program in religious studies at SMU, Nick Klemetson, a candidate in the Doctor of Pastoral Music degree program at Perkins School of Theology, SMU, and Deanna Witkowski, who recently completed her PhD in music at the University of Pittsburgh. So each presenter will have 20 minutes for their presentation, followed by 5 minutes for questions and answers. So we are on a tight schedule. We want to make sure we get you all to lunch in time. So I will be sitting here with my timer, and we encourage you to think about any questions that you might have for each of the presenters. So I'm delighted to welcome our first presenter, Fernando Berwig Silva.
Mics, always mics. First, I just want to acknowledge this space as an emergent scholar, graduate student. Thank the Hymn Society. There's a thing we say in the Hispanic Theological Initiative, and Tony is here, thank you for being here. We do scholarship en conjunto, in relationship. And I really appreciate the space, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the presentations as well. In January of this year, the Center for Congregational Song of the Hymn Society, in partnership with Rede Criarte, an ecumenical collective of Latin American church musicians, gathered more than 20 Latinas and Latinos from various places of the world in one room for a very special occasion and very serious. But we're not talking about carne asada, churrasco, or parrilla, or however you want to call it. The first Latinx Leadership Connection Program, as it was called, aimed to connect worship leaders of Latin American descent, living and working in the United States, with worship leaders from across Latin America for a time of shared learning, relationship building, and inspiration. My paper looks specifically at the ways the participants of the Latinx Leadership Connection Program narrated ideas of appropriation, religious appropriation, borrowing, and solidarity, especially considering the events and musics that took place in Barranquilla. By broadly defining appropriation as a class of religious borrowings where individuals adopt cultural, musical, and religious practices without committing to doctrines, institutions, or ethical values in ways that worsen existing systems of structural justice, I demonstrate through the perspective of the program's participants that transnational institutional church music networks, like the Connection Program, can elucidate how United Statesian and Western narrations of appropriation are perceived through Latin American cosmological and epistemological lenses. As an ethnographic reflection, this paper joins the decolonial church music scholarship in exposing how notions of embodied knowledge, particular to Latin American context, challenge Euro-North Atlantic epistemologies that favor written, rationalist, individualistic ways of knowing and being. I structured the paper in three parts. First, I broadly defined appropriation as a United States and conceptual framework that delineates better behaviors or ethical ways of approaching cross-cultural, religious, and musical interactions. Then I contextualized this terminology in the happenings of the first Latinx Leadership Connection Program. By interviewing conference participants, I explore how these musicians use and understand appropriation as a category, showcasing how US conceptions of the term fail to successfully translate into the participants' understanding of musical borrowings. In the last section of the essay, I highlight some congruences of the participants' perspectives to the US notions of appropriation. Overall, I argue that understanding how appropriation's conceptual framework resists transnational and most specifically Latin American solidarities, we can understand and assess the role of church music in dismantling the matrix of colonial power, particularly what Walter Mignolo would call coloniality of knowledge. As I mentioned in the beginning of the essay, the first Latinx Leadership Connection program occurred in Barranquilla, Colombia, from January 25th to January 30th of this year. Although some of us got trapped in the airport for 3 days, thanks to American Airlines. Throughout the program, participants were invited to engage with foreign musics, learn new instruments, engage with social and cultural histories of other countries, and even compose in different music genres and music languages. Although Spanish was the default language, presentations also happened in Portuguese, in English, and Spanish. As my interview showed, the pervasive atmosphere was one of sharing and learning. More importantly, participants were engaged in creating new resources that would attend to their local needs in their communities. My position as a Brazilian church music scholar living in the US influences my approach to this topic. First, it is significant to note that all interviews knew me. As you have probably guessed, I was there. I attended the conference as a participant. Interviews were most of the times a continuation of conversations initiated during our time in Colombia. And I have to thank many of the conversations we had there for this paper to come up. The experience of producing scholarship in between worlds compelled me to take a Latin American phenomenological stance that is centered in embodied knowledge, everyday experiences, and in the particular wisdom of Latin American people. Therefore, this paper is not so much interested in new definitions and classifications of appropriation. Instead, I utilize the terminology as a more general umbrella for musical interactions that are understood as harmful, either by observers or participants. Following Liz Bucar's steps, I seek to sponsor discussions that leave the accusatory, condemning, and polarized arenas where appropriation has become an expression of moral outrage that once deployed halts potential elucidating conversations about cultural and racial dynamics. Appropriation as a concept first emerged in its cultural instance in the 1920s. Harlem Renaissance scholars raised concerns about problematic misrepresentations of African Americans in popular culture. Bucar explicates that the term is commonly applied nowadays for when individuals or entities of a dominant culture take from the culture of marginalized communities, resulting in harm or offense. Eric Mathis highlights appropriation's contextual and moralizing nature, explaining that context determines what appropriation is, when it happens, and what harm it causes. Taking appropriation's contextual nature, Bucar's working definition of the term is very, very valuable for us. The author describes it as an ubiquitous and malleable framework for ethical analysis of religious and cultural borrowings, one that assumes the existence of more ethical practices. She describes religious appropriation particularly as a class of religious interactions when individuals adopt religious practices without committing to their institutions, doctrines, systems of authority. By dialoguing with popular notions of cultural appropriation, Bucar invites readers to see religious borrowings as potentially ethically fraught through the harm and exploitations they might cause. Appropriation as defined by Bucar are especially common in the arts and are popularly referred as to cultural appropriations. This essay focuses on the intersection of all kinds of appropriations, paying specific attention to content appropriation, the incorporation by outsiders of cultural aesthetics and styles that are unique to a particular cultural group. Again, I use appropriation as a broader category, encompassing the messy intersection between religious, theological, cultural, and musical interactions, focusing particularly on what happened during the Connection program. Critical to appropriation are notions of insiders versus outsiders, power differentials, and cultural others. James Young, an important cultural appropriation scholar and philosopher, underscores the porous boundaries between participant, observant, and insiders, outsiders, sometimes ignored in many analytical enterprises that try to define practices as appropriations, particularly those in transnational scenarios. His concept of family resemblances, a way to address and define more broadly interactions between cultural groups that share cultural membership, political affinity, and historical happenings, gives us a clue as how participants of the Connection program understood the musical and liturgical practices of the conference. Early in the interview, it became clear that interviewees avoided narrating cultural and national differences as rigid cultural boundaries. Instead, most relied on familiarities between their cultural groups to contest discourses of harmful musical and religious borrowings. By focusing on solidarity and familial resemblances, conference participants form what Ayun Appadurai would call social neighborhoods, sites of productions of locality and political resistance, where subjects produce localized and embodied knowledge that contradicts hegemonic narrations of the group's identity, its social cohesion, and its political tendencies. Appadurai explains that as social formations, neighborhoods based on familial resemblances are places of epistemological and political resistance toward established powers, structures, and discourses. They create anxieties for Western nation-state delimitations and complicate preconceptions of selfhood as singular identities. In their nature, neighborhoods question linguistic uniformity, economic discipline, racial supremacy, political loyalties, and physical boundaries. In other words, the Connection Program's participants are architects of an emerging neighborhood interested in the relationship building between the Latin church musicians across the Americas. Aligned politically and theologically around the ideas of multiculturalism and ecumenical worship, they perceive discourses of appropriation as a way of policing these new sites of productions of locality. For participants, interpreting the cultural and religious borrowings that took place in Barranquilla as anything but solidarity becomes an ideological discourse that isolates neighborhoods in their work to dismantle oppressive projects. Furthermore, by delimiting boundaries between cultures and nations, discourses of appropriations are perceived as actively disassembling neighborhoods. Attendees also seem to understand the program as a place of strategic, ideological, and theological resistance. Amanda explains that to her, all participants shared a history of new colonialism. She said, "We are all conquered by other countries, and we're trying to leave this," end quote. Lydia, a Mexican church music leader, emphasizes solidarity as a key component of the borrowings during the conference. She says, quote, "I don't see it that way as appropriation. I had to learn how to balance this issue. We take music and use it here in solidarity with other groups," end quote. Extending or creating new strategically essentialized networks to undo oppressive structures that pervade Latin American church music practices also seem to be the goal of the participants. Mathis explains that strategic essentialism attempts to reject essentialist notions of a group as descriptively false while hanging onto a political notion of essential group identity in order to galvanize social reform. In other words, participants were aware of the fundamental differences between the musical, religious, and cultural practices among them. However, sustaining essentialized narrations of what it means to be a Latin American church musician serves a broader and more crucial social and theological transformation agenda. While US narrations of appropriation have an ethical goal focusing on delimiting insiders versus outsiders, participants were more worried about broader political and ideological struggles where outsiders are clearly defined. Worlds collide when one tries to understand the conference's happenings through the US lens of appropriation. A significant component of this epistemological collision that Lotus, a worship leader and clergy from the United States, narrated, and you can see it on the screen, is the racialized North American reality. Although Mathis emphasizes that cultural appropriations are not restricted to racialized groups, that there are marginalized groups that cut across racialized categories, he admits that race plays a vital role in the US notions of appropriation. Not only does race define group membership in many North American realities, but they also translate cultural practices into essentialized monolithic versions of complex ethno-racial populations. Lotus explained that her US racialized understanding of appropriation, a concept she holds dear and understands to be fundamental in the struggles of her US Latinx congregation, had to be resignified when attending the conference. She admits feeling an ongoing tension around racism, classicism, and colorism. Where she saw racism, Latin Americans saw classicism. Where she saw appropriation, other participants saw honoring. During music performance, she narrates asking herself, do we ask for permission? Are there people that are keeping us accountable? Ultimately, Lotus admits that cultural appropriation, a conceptual and ethical compass for her worship practices in the US, had to be nuanced. She had to inhabit an alternative epistemological world where racialized categories did not travel well. Contrary to Lotus' US perspective, other participants narrated with excitement the borrowings and exchanges that took place during the conference and outside of it. Lydia, the Mexican worship leader, said, quote, "In truth, it is beautiful when I know someone is playing and singing a Mexican song in another place. Something I composed in Mexico, for instance, and that people are singing in Brazil, Argentina, in Cuba." She claims local congregations in Latin America in general shared the same excitement. Jose, a Cuban seminary professor and musician, subverts normative understandings of appropriation and proposes it as a good and helpful practice. Furthermore, Jose argues that appropriations should be encouraged as they broaden the horizon of understanding the world, of understanding other people who live in other cultural contexts. Despite his openness and positive approach to appropriation, Jose emphasizes the role of relationships in making positive appropriations possible. He states that, quote, "Meetings like this one in Barranquilla, where people from different Christian traditions and different cultural backgrounds come together in a space to share what they do in their churches, helps in the assimilation and addition of these practices into other localized realities." The idea of translation seems to better fit the participants' worries in engaging other cultural groups' musics. In the book Illuminations, Walter Benjamin argues that translations should be less worried about transmitting precise language equivalences and meaning, but more concerned with intent. They should focus instead on the poetic and existential truths that textualities express. In the case of practices within the conference context, mastering the musical aspects of a national repertoire appears to embody this intentionality. Musical orthodoxy, playing the right rhythms, knowing the musical particularities of each genre, where they come from, and the correct instrument to perform them, is a way of preserving the smallest details of a vessel, while allowing music to be localized, to gain new meaning and richer meaning. Knowledge is not necessarily located in the sharing of meaning. Instead, it resides in music making, an embodied enterprise where one learns, appropriates, and resignifies. Most importantly, knowledge and music making happen in relationship, in conjunto. What my initial and localized investigation showcase is how normative conceptions of appropriation, mostly conceived in Western epistemological worlds, do not fully fit the perspective of these Latin American church musicians. Although most had ethical and ideological concerns about their positionality as Latino musicians, participants seemed not to draw rigid boundaries between their cultural groups represented in the conference. The participants' ethical, ideological, and theological concerns were instead in building networks of solidarity in which music played a vital role. Still, the conference was a place of ambivalence toward issues of racism, colorism, and identity. The conscious usage of essentialized discourses around Latino identity clearly generates tensions most felt by those experiencing the metaphorical and existential border of diasporic identities. My goal, however, was not to erase the problems of some of the discourses narrated by the participants, nor to deny the existence of cultural appropriation or racism in the pan-Latin American church music networks. Instead, I want to emphasize the tension inherent to essentialized nationalistic discourses and how that should instigate further research on how ethical concerns and intents of agendas, like the one of appropriation, can better suit the epistemological world of Latin Americans. Nevertheless, I recognize the positive potential inherent to participants' take on appropriation. As Becca Whitla emphasizes, Latin American embodied communal singing challenges, as Becca Whitla emphasizes, Latin American embodied communal singing challenges prevailing Western musical and theological expectations. Regarding appropriation, the Connection Program participants agree that religious, musical, and cultural appropriations are neither avoidable or desirable. Thank you.
Thank you so, is it on? Y'all hear me? Good. Thank you so much. So, if you want to go ahead. We have 5 minutes for questions and answers.
Thank thank you so much for this excellent essay. I think it really helps us, so many of us struggling with these questions, and offers some really important nuance. I was wondering if there was any conversation about the economics of appropriation, and I'm thinking about how a lot of music that comes to us in the US comes mediated through publishers or John Bell and the Iona community and other things like this, and how that fits into the overall narrative, because no music is pure, but it definitely doesn't come to us often without some kind of mediating factor, and how that, who's profiting on it, all of that, if that came up at all.
Thank you, Tony. As I said in the essay, I'm mostly focused on content appropriation, so really looking at what's being done, the practice that is there, and but definitely the economic exploitation and the nature of appropriation as music is a commodity nowadays, and church music is also a commodity. So those networks of economics are clearly playing a role in the ways one perceives something as Latino, or if you think of labels, genres, and etc. But I did not look at that perspective in this paper, but I'm sure there is research being done there. Chapter 2.
Fernando, thank you so much for this. That was a wonderful presentation. I have a kind of a follow-up question to Tony's. Did your interlocutors, I guess, express any perception, or at least even implicitly talk about a perceived power differential between, say, the North Atlantic world, and maybe even specifically the North American world, and, say, the Global South or other places, and the way that that might frame understandings of appropriation for different constituencies?
That's a good question. I think the implicit vibe, if I can use this word, thank you for your question. It was one that, as one of the Argentinians there explained, we're new colonized nations. So there's this sense that we're not them, so this term will not, enter this world. And from the US perspective, there's also the recognition as kind of like an imperial actor, a power differential. And you see in Lotus, one of her, and I don't know if I put it in the slide, she mentions the privilege of having a US citizenship. She's aware of it. And I think those things are also playing there. And I think they're cognizant of it. And I think the way appropriation also travels, those worlds are connected to this. But yeah. Welcome.
Fernando, thank you for your presentation, particularly in the work that I'm doing and my own social location. I find it very interesting and illuminating how this term of appropriation is perceived in other cultures. From a Black and a US perspective, certainly there's a lot of negative baggage with that, the hegemony, the marginalization, the theft, and so forth. But it was refreshing to hear that other cultures don't, and I would venture to say that that has probably been a way that the US has seen and acted in this until maybe more recent decades, because there is borrowing, there's always been borrowing. Composers in the classical period borrowed from one another, and we've not, demonized them for doing so. So for me, this has been very illuminating to re-engage and reimagine the use of this word. And am I understand you also correctly that the way that this plays out in the US is not how it's been playing out in the Latin world?
Yeah, I think, yes. Thank you. Yes, that's the real. I think my overall goal was to say that, like, the concept of race, the category of appropriation does not travel well. It will not. It cannot be imported. It's not a commodity. You cannot just simply extract it and put upon Latin people and say, use this because this will work. The racial dynamics, the racial history of Brazil, for instance, which is my positionality, is completely different, although shares many similarities. And being attentive to those relationships is important. And also, the positionality of Latino people as using this strategic essentialism is vital in kind of erasing some of the issues that are there there is racism, there is colorism, there is many problems that are in those music practices that I would say there are problems. But because of this strategic essentialist agenda, they kind of get together and do it anyways, you know. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions. Let's thank Fernando once again. And we now welcome Nick in his presentation.
Wow. Hi, everybody. I wanted to thank the Hymn Society for the invitation. This is a great honor and a true privilege to be here. You may look at this title, How Does a Hymn Mean, and think that's maybe a little grammatically suspect. Well, you'd be right, but it has a precedent. How Does a Hymn Mean was inspired by a book by John Ciardi called How Does a Poem Mean, written in 1959 with a second edition in 1975. It offers insights on how a reader can understand and interpret poetry on their own, instead of just telling us what his interpretations of poetry are. He encourages us, the readers, to understand and to guide themselves to their own interpretations using a set of tools that he outlines. And as a result, it enables us to create a practical way to engage with poems. And it enables us to directly interact with these texts instead of relying on frameworks or stereotypes or other things. And I'll share some examples later. A little closer. I'll share some examples later for how we can apply some of Ciardi's methods for hymn analysis. But first, I wanted to show you how various sources have defined a hymn, and as well as a definition of my own that will guide the rest of the presentation. So, what is a hymn? Let's get rid of the convoluted question for a minute and just bring back a more basic one. What is a hymn? We'll start with a definition offered by Carl Price, who was one of the founders of the Hymn Society in 1922, and he wrote this definition in 1937. A Christian hymn is a lyric poem, reverently and devotionally conceived, which is designed to be sung, and which expresses the worshiper's attitude toward God or God's purposes in human life. It should be simple and metrical in form, genuinely emotional, poetic and literary in style, spiritual in quality, and in its ideas so direct and so immediately apparent as to unify a congregation while singing it. Wow. That's a lot to live up to. And the contemporary issues one could bring up with this definition are a bit beyond the purview of this presentation, but I think several of them have likely popped out at you by now. Let's fast forward about 80 years and look at another definition of a hymn published in Sing with Understanding, 3rd edition. Dr. Michael Hahn and his team of hymnological scholars created a broader, more inclusive definition of hymnody. It reads, Christian hymnody includes everything that the Christian assembly sings in the enlivening of Christian worship. The enlivening of Christian worship. Remember that word. I was introduced to Sing with Understanding 3rd edition as a part of my DPM coursework with Dr. Hahn, and one of the assignments he gave us was to create our own definition of a hymn. I was inspired by the Sing with Understanding definition, and this is what I came up with. A hymn is a sacred lyric poem paired with a corresponding melody that illustrates, describes, or supports the Christian story and enlivens worship, regardless of ecclesial context. There's enlivens again. We'll put all of these three definitions side by side. It's important to briefly compare and contrast them, so I just wanted to point out a few small differences. First, note how Carl Price's definition and mine begin. They both use the word hymn, and they both refer to lyric poetry. The Sing with Understanding definition uses the word hymnody in lieu of hymn, which I think is a larger, a more all-encompassing word, sort of like the all squares are rectangles, but not every rectangle is a square idiom. All hymns are hymnody, but is everything labeled hymnody a hymn? Oh, it's an interesting question that deserves exploration, but not now. Second, note that my definition is the only one of the three to specifically discuss a melody. The other two definitions refer to the act of singing, which implies a melody is present. But in my definition, a melody is an intrinsic, irremovable part of the definition itself. So a hymn is words, a hymn tune is a melody, but a hymn is not a complete entity until it is able to be sung. We have a substantial amount of scripture to support this. We heard from our wonderful hymn festival last night, Colossians chapter 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. In Psalm 40, verse 3, King David says, God put a new song in his mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. And even in the Passion story, Jesus and his disciples went to the Mount of Olives after singing a hymn. Hymns and tunes are separate entities, and both of them rely on the other to become complete. A hymn without a melody is a poem, and a hymn tune without words is just a melody. In his book, Let the People Sing, Hymn Tunes in Perspective, Paul Westermeyer suggests that it's the tune that carries a hymn and not the text itself. Some tunes are very, very difficult to separate from their corresponding texts. The memory banks of churchgoers are a very powerful entity. And a creative church musician might have a difficult time introducing a new tune to their congregation for Amazing Grace or for Joy to the World. It'd be a challenge. But swapping out a tune for a text that maybe isn't as ingrained in people's memory banks is possible. And sometimes even advantageous for a hymn that might be lesser known and not a part of the memory banks. An example from my context is the hymn tune Michael, which is by Herbert Howells, often set to the words, all my hope on God is founded. And my congregation struggled mightily with this tune, not the Michael tune. But they really enjoyed the words and they wanted to sing them, so I crafted a new tune that was more stylistically appropriate for my worshiping community at the time. We can sing this together. Here's a D, 1, 2. All my hope on God is founded, who will all my trust renew, who through change and chance will guide me, only good and only true. God unknown, God alone, call my heart to be thine own. Thank you for that. So it brings us back to our initial question, inspired by Chiardi. How does a hymn mean? As important as language is in our daily lives, it has limitations. And I believe these limitations are heightened when discussing the nature of God, because it's our earthly words that are somehow responsible for discerning and demonstrating God's presence. And that's a huge task. And this is where specific literary devices play such an important role in poetry, and by extension, hymnody. For instance, metaphor. Chiardi points out that metaphor awakens the imagination, and it invites the reader's participation. Metaphor is a powerful, essential tool for understanding God's presence, since it is well suited to speaking about the transcendence of God. To know God is to embrace the mystery of God. And metaphorical devices used in hymns can help us to decode this mystery. I had a privilege of attending Jan's session yesterday about her hymns in her collection, and thanks to Carl Daw, we sang Unexpected and Mysterious together. The entire first stanza is full of not technically metaphor, but a lot of metaphorical devices here. We cannot directly hear the gentle words of grace in an audible sense. We cannot directly feel God's embrace in an empirical way, but the adjectives that accompany these tangible actions assure us that the unexpected, mysterious, ever-loving, sustaining God is here for us to console us as a loving mother would, which is how the stanza ends. Stanza 2 starts with my favorite line in the whole hymn, "In a momentary meeting of eternity and time." If you think about that too hard, it might cause an existential crisis. You have time, which is a measurable period in which things happen, and you have eternity, depending on which branch of academia you ask. Time may be meaningless in eternity. There's no beginning, there's no end, it just is. So why are we worried about time? Then you have these two things, eternity and time, coming together momentarily. And what happens at this momentary meeting of eternity and time? It's the Annunciation. It seems especially fitting that at this junction of paradoxical entities, eternity and time, a fully divine presence would be manifest as fully human. It represents the manifestation of the nature of God here on earth, which is a mystery that we ponder later in the third stanza. The tune that's meant to be paired with this poem is St. Helena. And if you don't know this tune, it's you may know it set to There's a Wideness in God's Mercy. A very evocative tune that cultivates a sense of awe and wonder that is especially profound during the anticipatory Advent season. Another poetic device is anaphora. This is a technique that creates structure by repeating a word or repeating a phrase. And two examples of this are Jerry Vida's Now the Silence and Herbert Brokering's Thine the Amen. These hymns are both unique in that neither of them contain any structural punctuation. It's just free-flowing words. Now the Silence is contained in one stanza, and it describes liturgical images and actions that prepare us for communion. Now the silence, now the peace, now the empty hands uplifted. And of course, the repeated word is now. Thine the Amen is a longer poem that is full of biblical allusions. And we can take a look at stanza 2 here. This stanza is full of eschatology. Midway through, the repeated word, the anaphoric word, changes from thine to gone. And it's the economy of language here that emphasizes the magnificence of this crucifixion story. Gone is the suffering and pain of the crucifixion, as Christ's death has led to eternal life for humanity. And what both of these hymns share is a repeated word, now and thine, that is seemingly innocuous. These small words facilitate and possibly even contain the true crux of both of these texts. That's one of the ways of how a hymn means. Despite being small words, mild words, they carry great theological weight. She already mentions that the language of good poetry is active. The words now and thine, despite being these small words, they're both very active in their own ways. Now highlights that God is ever present throughout the Eucharistic feast. And thine is our continual pledge that everything we offer in worship is for God. And we circle back to that first bullet point, which has been there for a while now. Language alone is inadequate for expressing the fullness of our spiritual realities. This is why the question, how does a hymn mean, is so important and so vital. For instance, with these two hymns, their tunes, which both happen to be by Carl Schalk, both contribute to their meaning. The tune for Now the Silence has an ambiguous tonality throughout, and just despite its being rooted in F major, the tune ends on the note G, which is the second scale degree. It lends a feeling of continualness. Even though the hymn is finished, the Eucharist, the ideas of the Eucharist continue on. And the tune for Thine the Amen is very stepwise and chant-like. It flows seamlessly, just like the words do. And at the end of each stanza, the tune ascends a full octave to a climactic note that reinforces the theological pinnacle of each stanza. Friends, this is how a hymn means. It's the marriage of text and tune, poetry and melody, syntax and song. They all combine together to create, to go back to Dr. Hahn's definition, an enlivening worship experience. And as worship planners, we can harness these powerful tools to unify our congregations to the best of our abilities. You know, despite us all having diverse people with diverse preferences and experiences and knowledge. As Fred Pratt Green asks in one of his great hymns, how often, making music, we have found a new dimension in the world of sound that moves us to a more profound alleluia. We can and should all strive for a more profound alleluia by asking ourselves, how does this hymn mean? And we put that question at the forefront of our worship planning, our research, our writing, as we explore ways of creating theological expressions in our worship and enlivening worship experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now have 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, good, I'm off the hook.
I don't have a question so much as an anecdote. The late Alec Whiten of sacred memory, when we brought out the hymnal 1982, was going around doing workshops, largely fielding questions about things that had changed, God forbid. And one of them was the loss of a certain text that was set to the tune Ebenezer. And so what he would do in these workshops is he would have people, first of all, sing the lost hymn, Once to Every Man and Nation, to the tune Converse, usually used with What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So once to every man, it's not the same thing. And then he would have people sing What a Friend We Have in Jesus to Ebenezer. What a friend, as he put it, that's a different sort of friend.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you have considered at all that division, which is maybe not such a division, between psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And how would you treat psalms in your definition of hymn?
I've considered that a lot, and it's something Dr. Hahn called me out on. In my definition, hymnody implies lyric poetry. So psalms, of course, are church music. It's the original church music. The Psalter was the first hymnal. Spiritual songs, global songs, all of these things you wouldn't, in my definition, which is still evolving, wouldn't be classified as a hymn in that kind of academic sense. But it's all hymnody, it's all congregational song, it's all the song of the church and the song of the people. So. gotta go.
Of course, we have sitting right here someone who devoted 3 volumes to metrical settings.
I know, and I wrote on one of them for a Canterbury Dictionary.
So that would be included in your definition. If they
Right,
were
since
metric
they're metrical paraphrases of the Psalms, so they transform into lyric poetry in that sense. So
there is no
according to my
difference.
definition, those are all hymns.
Up top.
Excuse me, thank you for that presentation. Your discussion of metaphor and anaphora, I think, was just excellent and very enlightening when you brought in those examples. My question to you is, were you an English major in college?
Absolutely not.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I'm still, Chiardi's book is very dense and very involved, so I'm still wading my way through it as I'm continuing to evolve these thoughts.
I appreciate what you said about the use of metaphor in hymnody. I wonder if you would reflect on whether, and if so, how hymns ever mean what they say literally.
Hymns have meaning, what they say
Do hymns have
literally?
literal meaning, or is a hymn's meaning always metaphorical?
No, I don't think so.
Can you talk about the literal meaning that one might find in hymns?
You're putting me on the spot
I'm a
here.
philosopher, so I get to ask questions like that.
Well, I think in the hymn Carl mentioned a minute ago, what a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. That's literal. He bore our sins on the cross. Don't you think? Well, the word literal has also evolved a lot too. Yes, literarily, I like that. But it's that action of submitting himself to be crucified that took our sins from us and led us to the heavenly kingdom. I know that's not the best answer, but that's a tough one to come up with on the spot.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Nick. And we now move to... And we welcome our final presenter, Deanna.
Well, thank you to Steph, and thank you to all of you for being here. I want to clarify, my PhD is in jazz studies. I just finished at the University of Pittsburgh. It's the only school in the nation that has a PhD in jazz studies, and I moved to Pittsburgh because of this woman, Mary Lou Williams. I wrote a biography of her several years ago, and she led me to the Pittsburgh area, but she was born here in Atlanta, just within a few miles of Emory. Thought it best to drop the mass. Everybody has written a jazz mass. So wrote jazz pianist-composer Mary Lou Williams in a June 1966 letter to her friend Mario Hancock. We might react with surprise to such a statement today. Yet, when Williams wrote these words, she was not the sole composer, marrying jazz with liturgy. The spirit of ecumenism fostered by the Second Vatican Council and the popularity of Catholic President John F. Kennedy led to a fascination with religion, and Catholicism in particular, from the film industry and record labels in the 60s. In 1966, RCA Victor released flutist Paul Horn's Jazz Suite on the Mass Text album, which won the Grammy Award for Best Instrumental Composition for its composer Lalo Schifrin. In early '67, Columbia released the Jazz Mass by Joe Masters, featuring his mass originally written for a liturgical arts festival in Elmira, New York, and my mother lives in Elmira. The phenomenon of jazz masses became so widespread that it even became a source of satire for artists such as social commentator Al Jasbo Collins. Mary Lou Williams is often discussed as an anomaly who blazed her own trail by composing jazz masses in the late 60s. However, scholarship has tended to ignore religious communities that helped set the groundwork for composers, including Williams and Eddie Bonamere, both of whom created jazz settings of the liturgy. One congregation in which Williams and Bonamere worked was St. Thomas the Apostle Church, an African-American Catholic parish in Harlem. And this is what it looks like today, though it's no longer functioning as a parish. In 1967, both composers accepted invitations to write jazz masses for St. Thomas, resulting in Williams's Mass for the Lenten season and 4 masses by Bonamere, starting with his Advent Mass. 1967 also marked the start of a 30-year partnership between Bonamere and St. Peter's Church, a predominantly white Lutheran church in Midtown Manhattan. While serving as music director at St. Thomas from 67 to 71, Bonamere was presenting his liturgical music on a monthly basis at St. Peter's, where he would compose 10 jazz liturgies, including this one, Missa Laetare. Known as the Jazz Church due in large part to its long-running weekly jazz vespers beginning in 1966, and with its first pastor to the jazz community, the Reverend John Garcia Gensel, St. Peter's lived out an ecumenical theology espoused by interreligious organizations such as the National Council of Churches. While Williams and Bonmare's late 60s sacred jazz was centered in New York City, both composers wanted their music to be used widely. To facilitate this, they created simplified scores to include church music directors in their intended audiences. Each composer exerted their own agency in deciding when and what to self-publish, or whether to seek opportunities to publish with religious music imprints. Bonmare's papers include correspondence with Fortress Press, which we know now as Augsburg Fortress, but then it was both a sheet music publisher and record label. His papers also include letters he wrote to Archbishop James P. Like, the coordinator of the first Black Catholic hymnal, Lead Me, Guide Me, which was published by GIA in '87. Mary Lou Williams's archive includes her 1972 piano vocal score for Music for Peace. This score became one of the source documents for the newest performance edition of the work that I created for the Mary Lou Williams Foundation in 2021. And this is what any choir in the country that wants to use this work uses. In addition to their scores, Bonamere and Williams consolidated their legacies by recording. While Bonamere received financial support from St. Thomas and sometimes from Fortress Press for several albums, he released 3 sacred music records on his own label, Amity Records. Williams released Mary Lou's Mass and its predecessor, Music for Peace, on her own Mary Records imprint. Although Bonamere has more music recordings and scores in terms of his sacred music than Williams, it is her Mary Lou's Mass that remains arguably better known. Yet it is Bonamere and not Williams who has a number of pieces in Lead Me, Guide Me, and in several other Protestant hymnals. I posit that part of the difference in legacy in regard to these composers' sacred music output is due to the fact that Williams was attuned more to her audience outside of churches, while Bonamere focused his attention on opportunities sponsored by churches, conferences, and early Black Catholic organizations. And this is something I address in my larger dissertation. My introduction to both composers' sacred music began with visits to their archives, and in fact, their archives are really the best place to find much of their sacred music. In 1999, soon after composing my own first jazz mass for All Angels Church in New York City, I became aware of Williams's 3 jazz masses via a new Williams biography by Linda Dahl called Morning Glory. I read that biography soon after accepting an invitation from Williams's friend, the late pianist Dr. Billy Taylor, to perform at the Kennedy Center's Mary Lou Williams Jazz Festival with my quintet. On playing that festival with Williams's name in it, I felt a responsibility to learn more about her life and music because you see, many jazz musicians today still only know a tiny bit of Williams's output. So on playing that festival and reading the biography, I wanted to find her masses, and finding only one of them, Mary Lou's Mass, commercially available, I began to visit her archive at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University. Fast forward to 2019, when I accepted an invitation from Liturgical Press to write what became this book, a Williams biography for their People of God series on popular Catholics. And I also released this recording 2 years ago, Force of Nature, that includes all of my arrangements of a bunch of Mary Lou Williams instrumental music. I returned to the Institute of Jazz Studies to keep researching, and on my return, my curiosity was spiked by correspondence regarding Williams's Lenten Mass that mentioned Eddie Bonamere. Learning that Bonamere's papers were housed at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, I visited, where I found letters from a Father Bob Ledegar, a professor of liturgy at Mary Knoll Seminary, and someone whose name I had just encountered in Williams's archive. In fact, the subtitle of Jazz in the Pews, which is Experiments in Sunday Worship, comes from Ledegar's letters to Williams and Bonamere, inviting them to create jazz masses as part of a series of, quote, experiments in Sunday worship of a more contemporary style at St. Thomas. Finding congregational song sheets in Bonamere's repository, I realized that I would need to spend much more time at the Schomburg, which I did, to learn more about the community of St. Thomas the Apostle. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the beginnings of the jazz ministry at St. Thomas in order to ask, what defines jazz ministry? I'll also briefly share one of Bonamere's most well-known songs. While the Reverend John Garcia Gensel at St. Peter's is probably the best-known clergy person to be affiliated with jazz ministry in New York, it was a Catholic priest named Father Kevin Kelly who founded the jazz ministry at St. Thomas in 1967. 1 year earlier, Kelly attended the premiere of Bonamere's Missa Hodierna, which is credited as the first jazz mass to be used in a Catholic church at St. Charles Borromeo Church in Harlem. That summer, Kelly was assigned as assistant pastor at St. Thomas on West 118th Street, and the location is really important because St. Thomas was half a block away from Minton's Playhouse, which was one of the birthplaces of bebop. Kelly began by procuring a dozen apartments in the surrounding neighborhood and filling them with seminarians from Union Theological Seminary and from Mary Knoll Seminary. His primary instruction to these new residents, according to one of his interviews, was, quote, to get the hell out on the street and act as a neighbor. He also implemented changes inside the church, knocking out the communion rail, in his words, quote, for theological reasons. That's all I got on that. Seeking to revitalize the music, he recalled the vibrant participation of the congregation at the premiere of Missa Hodierna. Partnering with Father Ledegar, the two priests invited Bonamere to participate in, quote, an experiment in liturgical music for the Roman Catholic Mass. Ledegar explains to Bonamere in a September 1967 letter that this experiment will include commissioning composers to create a year's worth of new Mass settings, beginning with Advent that December. He invites Bonamere to compose initially just an Advent Mass, and to serve as music director of the overall project. 1 month later, Ledegar wrote a similar letter to Williams inviting her to write a Lenten Mass. Both composers did accept these invitations, and Bonamere became music director for the 11 a.m. Mass at St. Thomas. On December 3rd of 1967, his Advent Mass was sung for the first time. The instrumentation included 9 instrumentalists and 8 teenagers who comprised the youth choir. Bonamere refused to audition singers to show that the music was accessible to anyone, regardless of whatever form of musical training they had or did not have. In weekly bulletins, Father Kelly urged the congregation, if you can imagine this, to arrive 30 minutes early each Sunday to practice their sung parts. Soon attendance at the 11 a.m. Mass grew, equaling that of the other weekend liturgies. In the fall of 1968, a self-governing group of parishioners involved with the jazz ministry named themselves the Community of St. Thomas the Apostle. Using the 4 Mass settings that he had written in his first year at St. Thomas, Bonamere now got rid of the choir, and relied on his song leading and instrumentalist to lead the congregational singing. The jazz ministry was becoming more widely known due to an August 1968 appearance at the National Liturgical Week, where Bonmere and the St. Thomas Choir led his Mass for every season, that's his third Mass, with 5,000 attendees. In January 1969, Father Kelly borrowed some money to produce a recording of Mass for every season, which is what this is from, with a 15-voice volunteer choir and a 9-piece band. The self-released album included a pamphlet on the jazz ministry, as well as a single-line score of the Mass setting. That same month, in the journal Liturgy, an uncredited reporter wrote an article describing a visit to St. Thomas. The writer notes that the service feels alive because its members are involved in every aspect of the ministry, including planning the content of each week's liturgy. In describing the singing, the writer confesses an initial disappointment at first that the music is not, quote, concert-like in quality. This quickly changes, however, as they further note that, quote, the singing at the St. Thomas Mass is glorious and fun and full of hope. In that same article, Father Kelly addresses the element of imperfection in communal worship, stating, quote, often people who come to one of our Masses are expecting something flawless, and that isn't the way life is. Beauty, song, music, artistry, yes, but with these always the element of imperfection, the element of not knowing exactly how it's going to work out. This necessity to be willing to take risks was a key part of both Bonmere and Kelly's philosophy of communal ministry. I refer to the community of St. Thomas the Apostle as a jazz ministry, as the participants there did, that began with invitations to two composers, Mary Lou Williams and Eddie Bonmere. These composers were not advised to write in a specific style, and each had their own unique sound. Listening today, one may be hard-pressed to identify much of Bonmere's Masses as jazz, but rather than label his music or Williams's religious music under a particular genre, I propose instead that we keep in mind a comment that Williams made during a broadcast on the Riverside Church-sponsored radio station WRVR in 1968. After playing a recording of St. Martin de Porres, which is a gorgeous a cappella 1962 choral work that Mary Lou wrote that appears on this album, Williams responds to host Max Cole's query regarding the sound of her new sacred music, and here's a bit of their exchange. Cole says, well, tell me, are you working jazz feeling into your sacred works now more, Mary Lou Williams? Williams, yes, quite a bit. Cole, I was just going to say you're treading with caution, is that it? Williams, not too much, I'm just writing Mary. I'm trying to write myself, and I think I'll win that way. Williams's comment regarding writing herself, that is, creating her music in her own voice, shows her willingness to try something new without regard for genre or reception. Neither Williams or Bonmere knew what their music would ultimately sound like as performed by a mix of instrumentalists, amateur choirs, and a gathered people in the pews. In Bonmere's case, his calypso influence to people still unborn from Mass for Every Season shares similarities with his instrumental music from this release on Prestige in 1964 called Jazz Oriented. Bonmere was simply writing himself, even while keeping in mind parameters of writing for group singing. So if the music created for St. Thomas was jazz or wasn't jazz, why refer to the 4-year existence of this Harlem community as a jazz ministry? Does the style of music define the congregation, or are there characteristics of jazz that underlie the philosophy of active participation? I argue the latter. Over and over again, Father Kelly emphasizes the degree to which the community must be willing to fail and try again, key elements in learning to improvise. Williams, Bonmere, Ledegar, Kelly, and the entire community's participation in their experiment in Sunday worship had to be met with the same degree of risk-taking and even a willingness to fail. Although Williams and Bonmere ultimately experienced different types of responses to their religious works and navigated their networks in different ways, both of their individual jazz ministries, which continued long after the 1967-68 liturgical year, were crucially formed at the community of St. Thomas the Apostle. So I am going to play and sing a very short song by Eddie Bonnemere that came from his Mass Missa Laetare. He wrote this during his first year at St. Thomas, but it was written for St. Peter's Church. However, he did it often at St. Thomas, and it's called Help Me, Jesus, and I'm going to invite you to join me after I sing it once. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. He doesn't care about the color of your skin or what religion you've been in. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Let's see if we can try it. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. He doesn't care about the color of your skin. He doesn't care about the color of your skin or what religion you've been in. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Let's try it one last time. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the color of your skin or what religion you've been in. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself.
Thank you so much. So we have 5 minutes for our final question and answer.
Oh, this was so good. Thank you so much, Deanna. I had some in the weeds questions, and I'm probably going to go off script. So if you want to not ignore my questions, you can. But I had 2 specific questions, and one was about the text of Mary Lou's Mass, because I noticed that it's not exactly like the original ISIL text that were coming out at the time. It's kind of a melange of things.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was kind of her own text that she was working with. And I was wondering about the first recording that was reissued like 20, 15 years ago, whatever. And because I noticed that that's kind of rough. I mean, I love it, but it's not like super polished. And I was wondering if you knew anything about the making of that.
This was a very, 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 very tiny part of my larger dissertation, and I have a whole huge part on, so the Mary Knoll priest I mentioned, Father Bob Ledegar, he was really involved with liturgical committees right after Vatican II, and especially in drafting the place of music in Eucharistic celebrations, which was like an early, document that came out to help music directors have some idea of what on earth are we supposed to do, right? So, but he wrote much of the text for Eddie Bonnemere. Bonnemere wrote, help me Jesus, Bonnemere wrote that text. But he was credited as being liturgist, which kind of meant something specific at that time, in the 60s, and as doing word adaptations. So he also worked with Mary Lou, and in fact, there's a Kyrie for our lack of faith, Lord have mercy, for our failure to care, Lord have mercy. Bonnemere has a setting Williams has a setting. It's Ledegar's text, additional text. So in a way, he was a lyricist too, right? So that's one thing. Then your other question was about the reissue in 2005 from the Smithsonian Folkways, which was the reissue of the original record. So it gets very confusing. When I first started, getting into Mary Lou's stuff like 25 years ago, I had to try to piece this all together. Because she did Music for Peace in 1970, which didn't have an on-use day. It didn't have a full mass. When Alvin Ailey choreographed it, he rechristened it Mary Lou's Mass. She wrote 5 more movements, including the on-use day, then included all the stuff from Music for Peace, the additional movements on Mary Lou's Mass. That's what got sort of remastered, but not too much, and released on that Folkways record. So one of the things I've done that, I didn't have time to talk a lot about photos, but there was one here that showed, this is a video you can hear on YouTube. So this piece had only been done in the US in liturgies, never in a concert setting. And so this was with the Stonewall Chorale and my trio in New York a couple of years ago. This is on YouTube, but we had to do a lot of tweaking to the scores that are available because really, I had to go back to the archive a lot. Yeah, sure.
Deanna, thank you for this presentation. I was waiting for this, and this work figures into some of the work I'm doing, and I would really love to have a longer conversation than right now. But one specific question that I've been pondering for some time in terms of perhaps why more popularity or more use liturgically for Bonamere than Mary Lou Williams, in my thought, it's because his melodies were more accessible to the congregation. Whereas perhaps Mary Lou Williams' music was more musically sophisticated, arguably. I think that's more of a subjective thing, but because of the complexity of some of the music, and I'm more familiar with Bonamere's music than Mary Lou Williams, but would you say that maybe that was why the folks could just join in with her, with Bonamere's?
Right. So I'll say 2 things about that. I think Bonamere's music is definitely, it's much smaller range, much more stepwise. I personally think, and it's just less memorable. Like I have a hard time remembering his music than I do Mary Lou's to go back and sing it. And she has stuff in her Lenten Mass that she wrote at St. Thomas that's not commercially available, that again, you can hear like if you go to this YouTube link, which I'm happy to provide, that some of that is more accessible. And also, this was the one time in her whole entire life that she had a period of 6 weeks where she got to do something every week. She wasn't a church music director. The other thing was World Library of Sacred Music, right, which became World Library Publications, wanted to publish her Lenten Mass. And I've tried figuring out what happened because I've seen letters from Owen Westendorf about that, and it didn't happen. So I think there's more of a story there than just musical characteristics, but that can certainly play into it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for coming to the Emerging Scholars Forum. Thank you to our presenters. Our judges are now going to huddle and meet, and the winner will be announced tomorrow morning during the announcements. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy your lunch.